Hi everyone, welcome to another SAWSA lecture. We're so happy that you're here, and we have Alun Jones speaking from Dow Jones Architects, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know him from, or know them from the Maggie Center here in Cardiff. So Alun, do you want to give like a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alun. I grew up in Caerphilly, just over the hill from where you guys are. Yeah, I am director of Dow Jones Architects, and we've been going now for 20 years, and we've done a number of cultural projects, a number of residential projects, a wide variety of different sorts of bits and pieces. And along with that, I've done quite a lot of teaching. I've taught diploma at a number of schools around the UK and Ireland. And so, yeah, that's sort of, in a nutshell, that's me.
Cool. So should we start the lecture now? One thing I want to say to everyone, if you have questions during the lecture, just put them in the chat box, and then afterwards we can ask them for you, or if it would be really nice if you wanted to ask them yourself and turn on your camera and audio for that. So yeah, should we get started?
Sure.
Okay. Is your screen working? The screen sharing option?
It's, yeah, hang on. Yeah, can you see that?
Yep, we can see it just fine. Thank you.
Great, okay. Well, thank you for asking me to come and talk at my telly. It's very kind of you. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about some of our projects, and I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that we work with as a way of describing or explaining how we think about projects and how we think about the work we do. So it's called Working With, and I've separated it into four topics. So working with art, working with material, working with landscape, and working with history. And I'm going to illustrate each of the sections with some ideas and some of our projects. So to get going, so art, I mean, what's interesting about art? We spend a lot of time looking at art and looking at artists, and the main reason why we do this is twofold. One is for the inspiration that it brings us, but secondly is as a way of finding a common ground to talk about experience with our clients. So what we're interested in is how we can begin conversations with people about architecture that come from a broader experience than just architecture itself. So we are, so this is an art piece by James Turrell, which on the face of it is just made out of red light. But obviously, light itself has no presence, and we only know light because of the surfaces that it lands on. And what's interesting about light is, in a way, light is a bit like ideas, that you have ideas about things, you have ideas, let's say, about architecture, but they need to find some form somewhere. And it's that transformational aspect, or that transformational quality of art, that we're interested in. So, sorry. So this is a project we did about 15 years ago in central London, in Borough, where we made this building on top of a warehouse in the middle of the city. And the starting point, or the inspiration for this project, was this painting, which is a painting of the house at Longleat. And what we were particularly interested in with this painting and how it relates to this project is that the point of this house is that it makes this horizon, and from this new horizon, with these little sweetmeat rooms, as they're called, sitting on top of it, you get this view of the landscape. And so when we were asked by our client to convert this warehouse into a dwelling in the middle of the city, we turned to this painting as a way of thinking about how we could develop an idea for the project. So the project was very much one about how we could connect the interior of this old warehouse to this extraordinary view that the building has across the city. But that view of the city was only visible from the roof. So we made this, this sequence of oak furniture items which take you up through the building, up towards the light. And when you get onto the roof, you then have this extraordinary view across the city. Here you can see St. Paul's reflected in this window. So what we were making was a new horizon at roof level that consisted of these pavilions that sat at roof level that would then reveal the horizon to you. So in the way that that painting did, we were then trying to embody that, or embody the spirit of that within this picture. Similarly, this is a project we also did many years ago in Walberswick in Suffolk, where we remade the village shop. And the village shop, for the village shop, we were interested in the vernacular fisherman sheds that you find in the town. But again, and that interest came out of this series of photographs by the Beckers, who meticulously photographed a taxonomy of, let's call it architectural form. I hope, well, you probably will remember that there was a Becker exhibition at the museum in Cardiff last year, which I assume you all went to. So moving on, the main project I want to talk about in relation to art is our Maggie Centre in Cardiff, for two reasons really. One is that one of the principal ideas behind the project was this painting, but also that the project itself is very much about housing art and working directly with artists as a way of realising the project. This is a painting by the American artist called Elizabeth Vellacott, and it's of the mountains just behind Llantoni. And what's interesting about this is the painting has a very, very specific, it portrays the specific character of that South Wales landscape. And that's something that we were interested in doing with our Maggie Centre. So this is the site for our Maggie Centre. It's a triangular corner of a car park, and arguably the worst site we've ever had to deal with. It's incredibly bleak. It's just a sea of cars surrounded by rather unappealing or uninteresting buildings. But the one thing that did interest us about the site, so this is a plan of the Felindra Hospital. This is our site in the corner. The one thing that excited us was this row of trees. So a lot of these trees are very old Victorian specimen trees. This is the plan of the Whitchurch Hospital behind it. So our site was pushed right into the corner, into this triangular form, but the redeeming feature was these trees behind the site. And so what we began to think about was how could we use our building as a threshold between the bleakness of that car park and the trees and the idea of nature and the landscape that's so dominant in the Welsh psyche. So on the left here, you'll all recognise that's Pen y Fan, and then on the right is a Welsh farmhouse. And the other thing we were trying to deal with in this project was some idea of using a slightly offbeat material, but a material that has a resonance both with the vernacular and agricultural environment, but also one that has a very clear resonance with the industrial heritage and the industrial past of South Wales. So At the heart of this project was a collaboration with an artist called Ozzy Rees-Osmond. And Ozzy was an amazing character. He was born in the South Wales Valleys. He was a painter, an artist, a raconteur, an extraordinary character. And Ozzy, very sadly, was diagnosed with cancer, and he was being treated at the Maggie's Centre in Swansea. And when he found out that Maggie's were making a centre in Cardiff, he got in touch with them, and he said he would be interested in getting involved somehow. And so that began an amazing collaboration with Ozzy about how we could think about the centre, how we could think about how the centre connects into what he would talk about as a psychogeography of South Wales. And at the heart of it was this painting, which he started, but as you can see, it's still got all the masking tape on it. He unfortunately didn't finish it before he died. But this is a painting from his, which is, like I said, it's a psychogeography of his childhood. So one of the things that we wanted also to bring to our Maggie's Centre was the idea of a cwtch. Now, some of you will be familiar with the word cwtch, which in Welsh means a cuddle, but it's also a little corner, it's a little space, it's an ingle nook, it's the kind of, you know, it's the space under the stairs where you go when you've just been told off by your mum. And so we were interested in bringing the idea of cwtch to a Maggie's Centre because it struck us that at the very heart of what Maggie's do is a cwtch. So this is a picture of the medieval farmhouse at St Fagans, which has this extraordinary chimney, which is so big, it's also a roof light. So this was an idea about how the cwtch might work. It would be a tall space that would let light in and would be a place where you could sit and be solitary. So this was the initial sketch for the Maggie's building. So what we wanted to do was make a building that was like a little mountain range that would be speaking to the local topography, and that it would be made out of corrugated steel, which would be orange, which, as you'll all be familiar with, the hills around Cardiff all go orange in the winter when the bracken dies. So we wanted to make our own little landscape, and that crucially, as you entered our building from this bleak expanse of car park, you would go into a little courtyard, which would be a little garden. And that little garden would then be the beginning of a narrative journey that would take you through the building and then represent these existing trees back to you. So this was the initial sketch idea. So the perimeter of the building effectively follows the outline of the site. You would enter into this corner, into our little courtyard. You would come into the building, and then inside the building, there would be these large furniture pieces of Douglas fir timber, and that those would then form the rooms between themselves. So rather than make the building as a series of walls, we would make a perimeter wall, and inside there would be these big lumps of wood floating around, and they would then subdivide the building up for you. We've always been interested in Donald Judd. Donald Judd, who was a 1960s American conceptual artist who made a lot of projects in Douglas fir plywood. And what was interesting about what Donald Judd was doing was he was taking an incredibly banal, everyday and very cheap material and through intention elevating it to the level of art. So this was the concept model of our little metallic shape, and then the beginning of an elevation study that would look at the character and the quality of this rusty facade. So this then effectively is the diagram that summarizes the project. So in the back, you've got the Orange Mountains, you've got the trees behind the building with the characteristic tower of the Whitchurch Hospital. Then you have our building, which is its own little mountain range with a tree in the courtyard that's in conversation with the tower. And then you've got this bleak car park and then the gap in the hedge. And then this diagram explains how the building works in plan. So you enter into the courtyard, these are the Douglas fir objects. You come in, you turn, you look down this vista, you see Ozzy's painting, you get drawn into the building, and then you get this big view into the trees. So you've gone from the car park via a little garden through this narrative journey, and then you have nature represented to you. And then all of the rooms of the building sit between the pieces of wood and the perimeter of the building. And then this is the Kutch, and the blue is the sky. So this was a sketch of the entrance courtyard, and then the view of the bit of landscape behind that would then be revealed to you as you move through the building. Another key part of this project was a collaboration that we had with a curator called Mike Tooby, who used to be the director of the National Museum in Cardiff. And we got in touch with Mike in order that we could discuss with him the possibility of him curating paintings in the building that we would then be very kindly lent by the National Museum in Cardiff, and that we would then use these paintings as part of the narrative journey around our building. So on the left is a painting by Mally Morris, and on the right is a painting by Bedger Williams, and you'll see when I show you the photos of the building how these paintings are situated and how they're used to move you around the building. Another artist we collaborated with is a textile artist called Linda Florence, who we've worked with on projects in London. And we worked with Linda to make a series of tiles that would line the hearth to the building. And we also worked with an American potter called Lisa Kriegel, who's now based in Cardiff. And she made this extraordinary range of crockery that's used throughout the centre. And then we worked with an artist called Pat O'Leary to reinvent the Maggie's logo in 3D clay to make the sign for our building. And then last but not least are the Anthony Gormley bollards that we've used to protect our building from the ravages of the car park. So this is the site plan, our building down in this corner. And then the ground floor plan, so the entrance, courtyard garden, and then this route through which takes you to the main room and the view into nature, the office, the small consulting room, the large consulting room, the Kutch, the hearth, and then the big room, and then loos and plant room are buried in the middle of the plan. So here you can see the cross section, and then in the middle you have the Kutch, which pierces up through the roof and drops light down into the space of the Kutch. So that's our little mountain range, and the idea we were interested in, as I said earlier, was trying to blur this distinction between the industrial heritage of Wales, but also this sort of agricultural aesthetic of the rusted corrugated steel. This is then coming into the courtyard garden and the view to the office, and then the view through the building. Here you can see Ozzy's painting on the side of the Kutch. And then this is the big room, and then the view out into the trees and out into nature. Then the hearth space behind the Kutch, where Lisa's tiles line the hearth. And then a long view all the way along the back of the building. So when all of the rooms are open, you get this extended view across the whole length of the building. And this is where we put this huge Mally Morris painting at the end. And then this is the main meeting room, and the view back then to the Kutch. And putting Ozzy on the side of the Kutch, it's like a sort of totem. It's like a sort of axis mundi. This is the heart of the building. And then inside the Kutch, you have this little timber flap that you can open and you see through to the garden, or you can lie on the daybed and watch the clouds go by. as a way of then finally connecting you to nature as the sky. So the second thing I want to talk about is material and the role it plays in our thought process. So this is Carl Andre's sculpture called Equivalent 8, which on the face of it is just a pile of bricks. But if you think about it perhaps slightly differently, what this is what this piece of work is about is extreme matter. It's an extreme expression of artifice and what we as humans do when we change things and when we adapt things. The word matter, where material comes from, the word matter itself is derived from the word mater or mother. And we think that's particularly interesting because if you think about matter being mater or Mother Earth, then there seems to be a rather poetic connection between the things that we as people, or specifically we as architects, use to make things out of and where they've come from. And we're really interested in the idea that you dig things up and you turn them into material and you turn that directly into architecture. And as a way, that digging up is a sort of gathering up of you could call it the sort of poetic mythos of the place, and it's reimagining as construction materials. So whenever we start a project, one of the
Wait, Alan, your mic just turned off.
Yeah, no, you unmuted me. One of the very first questions we ask ourselves at the beginning of every project is, what's this going to be made out of and why? And so this is a brickworks in Suffolk, which provided the bricks for 2 projects that we carried out at the beginning of our career. This house we made in Walberswick, which is called Poplar Cottage. And what we were interested in with this project was to make a building that was entirely made out of clay and oak, which are the 2 natural indigenous materials. So the clay products, so the roof tiles, the bricks, and the clay pavings were made by digging up the mud 5 miles from the site and cooking it into these materials, which we then turned into the building. And then inside, we wanted to make a building that had a very constructed presence. This is a painting by Uccello, Italian painter from the 15th century. And what's interesting about this painting is it's both very spare, but it speaks of a quality of interior space that could be entirely contemporary. So this is the inside of the house. The house, as I say, is made entirely out of clay and oak. So there's this very strong rhythm to the oak of the structure, and then all of the interior is made out of this very soft red brick. And then all of the windows and doors and floor is made out of oak. So there's this very gentle language which is put together in a very explicit and a very makerly way. But the main project I want to talk about with regard to material is a project that we finished about a year or so ago at St Mary Magdalene, which is a church in Paddington in West London. And this was a competition that we won, and the project is to create a new little building that will connect the church to the surrounding neighbourhood, because there's a very particular issue with regard to the topography of the site. So this is what the church looked like soon after it was built. As you can see, it's in an early Victorian crescent, and quite a vibrant neighbourhood. The other thing that's very interesting about the church is that from this level down, it's quite plain. But from this level up, it's extraordinarily ornamented and detailed. So our project at this building was to make this little intervention that would connect the various different levels that are in play across the site, and in so doing, open up this existing Grade 1 listed church for a far wider community use. So this is what the neighbourhood looked like in at the end of the 19th century. And into this image, you can see we've put our building here, showing it as part of the continuity of the grain of the city that existed. Oops. Oh. Sorry, let's, okay, hang on. My PowerPoint has crashed, so we'll just have to start it up again.
Okay, are you still able to share the screen, or did we click something?
I think I'm okay, hang on.
Okay, yeah, we can see it now.
You can see it, okay, great. So the site for this project was this incredibly narrow little slot of land between the west end of the church and the neighbouring school. But as you can see, the problem of topography that existed across the site meant that the west porch of the church had been bricked up. And this is the view from the south side of the site. So this was the back of the church, this was the school. And as you can see, there are 4 different levels in play here. You've got the level of the canal and the park behind the church. You've got the playground. The crypt is down there, and I'm taking the photograph from street level. So what this project is doing, it's connecting the park here down to the street here and the school. But the other thing that you can see is since the Second World War, all of those rather amazing Victorian crescents and terraces have all been demolished as part of a post-war slum clearance programme. And in their place, 6 tower blocks have been built. And so the church now finds itself completely marooned in a part of a city which it formerly had a very specific formal and textural relationship with. So a part of what we were trying to do was looking at addressing that question. The other thing, like I say, the church on the outside is very plain, but inside it's very elaborately ornamented. And on the chancel, you have these extraordinary materials. So there's a lot of gilding, there's a lot of, this is like opus sectile, there's a lot of gilding, and this is cast terracotta. So what we thought at the competition stage is the way to respond to this project is to make a little building that would bring the qualities of the interior out to the street as a way of signifying that something has happened with this building, but also signifying that this building is now open and this building is now welcome to a larger and wider audience. But also crucially, that we would use the building as a way of connecting the canal and the park to the street, to the nave and to the undercroft. So this is the site plan with the canal here, the church, the park, and then the street. And this then next door is the school. And this is a detailed section which shows how all of those levels connect. So at this level you have the school, the street. And this is the level of the undercroft that we were opening up as part of this project in order that the undercroft could be used as a public public meeting space. This level here is the level at which the building connects through to the school at the playground. And then this obviously is the level of the park. And then these are education rooms and meeting rooms that sit upstairs in our building. So the way that we've connected this through is via a new concrete staircase that connects from the crypt, and it connects all the way up through the building to this roof light, which the sun then drops down and runs across this shuttered concrete wall and connects the light down into the basement. And here you can see the connection through the other way. So the level of the street, the level of the nave, the level of the chancel. This is the porch that was previously bricked up, and then the undercroft. And so here's our little building up in this top corner. So we've opened up the whole of the undercroft of the church, which is now used by the wider community as a public space. And then at first floor level, you come into our building and you can then either take a stair up or the lift up to the level of the nave. At this level, you have public loos, or you can come through, you can go down and into the playground. So the children who use the undercroft for activities can now come straight from the playground, down the stairs and into the undercroft without having to go out into the public realm. And then at the level of the canal and the park, at the front of the building, you have this void. So when you come into the building, you're at the bottom of a 2.5-story high void with the light that drops down the stair, and then this sense of the park beyond. And then at the upper level is this education room and meeting room. So a lot of this project involved the restoration of the extraordinary building. The existing building was designed by George Street, and it's one of the very few Grade 1 listed Victorian churches in Britain. And so a big part of this project involved working with a group of local volunteers and specialists to clean and refurbish the extraordinary decorative scheme in the church. So this is it after it was refurbished. We redid the lighting in the church. This is the clean ceiling. And the church, the nave of the church is now used also for events. And then this is the undercroft that we've opened up. And what you can see here is this vaulting is very early in situ concrete. And so one of the reasons why we made our staircase out of concrete and the way that we connected our new building to the old building was through concrete, because this early in situ concrete was the way that Street made the structure of his building. And so to connect through between the Street building and our building, we inserted these enormous precast concrete lintels, which are then holding up the whole weight of the church. And you get this extraordinary sense of the mass and the work that these things are doing. And then to that, we then added these various linings where we needed to make, this is the bar and the ticket office for the events that happen in the undercroft beyond. So this is the section through the stair. These little spaces on the concrete were little recesses we cast into the concrete, and we made tiles with the local community to go into that wall, which tells the critical stories from the local history. Those tiles, we worked with Linda Florence again on those. So here you can see them running up the stairs, and they're talking about the immediate history of the neighbourhood. And then this is how the stair climbs up under the roof light, and you get these tiles and the timeline, which takes you up to the education room at the top of the building. And then the building opens up at the corners and then projects you out into the trees of the park with a view out over the canal. And this is the view then from the corner meeting room back to this extraordinary tower that we framed with this little corner window. So one of the main things that we were looking at with this building was, as I said earlier, how we could take the material from the inside of the building and use it for the outside of the building as part of a decorative scheme that was going to be talking about a more situated idea of how this building was made. So we started off by making this drawing of the tiles of the floor. So this whole floor pattern is made up out of, I think there are 3 different sorts of tiles. There's a black triangle, a red triangle, a red square and a black square. So there are 4, plus the white squares. So the whole of this pattern is made with just 5 different things, differently organized and differently arranged. So we thought, how could we use this? How could we use a terracotta material? How could we use something that would reflect the interior of the church and that would enable us to pattern it, that would then enable us to make this connection between inside and out? So we developed a program of faience tiles. So faience is a glazed terracotta, cast glazed terracotta. And what we thought we would do is we would take Street's original idea for these squares and triangles, and we would use them as a 3-dimensional frieze that would run around the whole of the outside of the building. So, and it would run around at a consistent level, and that frieze itself would then be patterned. So in the way that Street used a very limited number of elements, we would do the same thing, that we would have 4 or 5 elements and we would use that to make the whole ornamental scheme. So all of the beige is the precast concrete, which we talked about earlier, and the purple is then the glazed faience. So you can see it here on this slide, how the texture, the 3-dimensionality of the material is then providing the pattern. The formal organisation of the building was in order that we could make a little tower on the corner that would help to rotate the building because of the difference in the geometry between the side of the site and the flank wall of the church. We wanted to make something that would reconcile that acute angle. So we made this little 1.5 height tower in the education room. And we also wanted it to be in dialogue with the tower of the church. So as you walk through the park, you see the tower, you see our tower, and you begin to put the composition together. So this is the facade as it looks back at the canal. And as you can see, the faience, it's a sort of bronzy, aubergine brown colour. And depending on the light, sometimes it looks silver, sometimes it looks gold. If there's no sun shining on it, it looks very bronzy. And it's got this extraordinary lustrous surface, which begins then to speak of the qualities of the ornamentation inside the church that Street developed. And then in this image here, if you think back to that competition-winning idea of the reflective, shiny little building that's separating these 2 brickwork buildings and saying, well, look, you know, there's something here, there's something going on, this is different, this little tower responding to this tower, and making being in dialogue with the street. So the third topic I want to talk about is an attitude towards the landscape. This is a photograph I took about 25 years ago in Dungeness on the south coast of England, very near to Derek Jarman's garden. And what's interesting about this is how this little chimney, this fire, in this rather bleak and expansive landscape, speaks of a focus. It speaks of a place, and arguably it speaks of dwelling. The one thing it certainly is talking about is human presence and an idea of artifice. And one of the things that we think about a lot is there's this idea that Martin Heidegger develops, where he says something along the lines of that architecture gives direction to nature. And what's interesting about that is if you imagine this photograph, but just of the pebbles and the vegetation, it would be a very different proposition to that which we see here. And I think the point is that this is talking about the presence of activity. It's talking about the presence of dwelling. And the other thing that's interesting about this image is the way it talks about time. And it talks about the idea that perhaps this was in a building which is long gone, eroded by the weather and decayed, leaving this sort of essential masonry core at its very heart. Or perhaps they built this and never got round to making the building. Who knows? The important thing is that what this is doing is it's talking about artifice, it's talking about how we as humans give direction to nature and therefore enable how we organize that. This is a photograph by the photographer called Ruth Blaise Luxemburg, which is from a series she did looking at the London Tube line. And what's interesting about this photograph is it's unmistakably of a London tube station, but the way that it's reflected in the puddle, it's sort of talking about, let's say, the transience or impermanence of the ground within the city, and how in places particularly like London, what one sometimes assumes to be solid ground often isn't. And within that narrative, there's a deeper idea of context and history that's revealed to you through that. So with that in mind, the project I want to talk about is our project at the Garden Museum, which is located in this former church, St. Mary at Lambeth, which is next to Lambeth Palace on the banks of the River Thames. This was a competition that we won back in 2008, and it was to create a building inside the church that would house a temporary exhibition space and would deliver the museum the ability to have events within the church, but also an attitude towards the display of a permanent collection. So we started off by looking at this painting, which is by Damascene, and it's of St. Jerome in his study. And the reason why we were looking at this is St. Jerome is sitting in what appears to be a little timber building, and that's sitting in within this big old church. But crucially, it's all framed with regard to landscape and nature, which is seen through the window and through the presence of the various animals in the painting. So our initial competition scheme for the Garden Museum was to make a building at the west end of the church that would contain the exhibition spaces and an education room, and that we would make a little two-storey building, and that two-storey building would follow the rather curious geometry of the church, whereby on this side of the church, on this aisle, there are 3 columns, On this aisle, there are 4 columns, but the intercolumnation varies. So we use this curious geometry of the existing building as a way of setting up the geometry of our intervention. So this was a model that we made. The MDF is the existing building. The balsa wood is the intervention that we would put within the church. So we made this structure, which was made out of cross-laminated timber. And at the time, it was one of the very first buildings in the UK made out of cross-laminated timber. It was certainly one of the first to be made out of cross-laminated timber and then not clad or covered up. And the reason why we use CLT was because it's very light, it's incredibly strong, and whatever we put into the church as part of the brief said that it had to sit on the existing floor. And we knew that underneath this existing floor, or within, if you like, the landscape of the church, there are 36,000 bodies buried about a metre below the floor. So we knew that whatever we did inside this building had to be respectful of the archaeology that lies just below the surface of the site. So the idea that we were thinking about when we designed that building was again based in a painting. This is a still life by Morandi. And what's interesting about Morandi's paintings is the way that he paints the spaces between the objects with the same intensity that he paints the objects. We think that's a very interesting metaphor for how we make our buildings, where we're more interested in the space between than we are in the thing that we put there. So this was looking across the nave at the education room that we made at first floor level. So that project we made in 2008, and then in 2013, 14, the museum realised that they needed to expand their operation. So they then held another competition to make more exhibition space, but more importantly, they wanted to make a building that would include more education rooms and a cafe and offices, and effectively enable the museum to operate on a much larger stage. So this was our competition winning model that we made. And the main thing to look at in this model is the ground, or if you like, the landscape. This is a 1 to 200 model. The existing church is all machined oak. Our proposal is made out of polished copper, and the connecting tissue, that's just made out of sandpaper. But the important part is the ground. And we cast the ground in plaster. And what we did when we modelled this was we have modelled all of the existing gravestones and tombs that run across the site, because they provide the site both with this extraordinary texture and a very clear presence within the site, but also they talk about the narrative history of the site. And as I say, this lump of plaster has got 36,000 bodies in it. So the key question with the second competition for the Garden Museum was how we could connect what we did inside the church with what we were going to do outside the church. And for that, we developed this landscape strategy, if you like, whereby inside the church, we conceptualized it as a little city square where this part that we'd already built would be extended into the east end of the church with this little tower and this other building, and they would form part of a collection of buildings that would be like, let's say, a Tuscan hill town, all focused around the nave, which would be this public square, this public space for events. And then the cross-laminated timber structure would reach out into the garden as a sort of cloister building. So as we developed the scheme, we made this drawing, which was a drawing that we made in collaboration with English Heritage, as they were then called, and the local planning officer. And what this drawing is doing is explaining the various constraints on the site, which then in turn would determine how we design the building. So around the edge of the site, we've got 9 trees with tree protection orders on, and we couldn't build into the root zones of those trees. The planners didn't want us to come west of this point or west of that point. English Heritage didn't want us to build across the back of the church. All of these purple blobs are listed tombs. This is a protected view of Lambeth Palace that operates at first floor across the site. And then, as I say, a metre below the ground are the 36,000 bodies. So this is how the building then evolved. So we've got our little city inside the church around this market square. And then in the garden, we've got a series of pavilions that sit around a cloister that begin to frame the landscape and begin to build layers between the various elements of the city and of the landscape. So this is a plan of the final scheme. And all of these grey shapes, they're all the tombs that run across the site. And the pale ones are flush to the floor. The light grey ones are about 300 mil high. The dark grey ones were then waist height. So it's like a topography of gravestone. So our building, which sits here, accommodates all of these ledger stones within it, and it accommodates the grain of the site, the landscape grain of the site, within the confines of the building and within the confines of the cloister that we made. And then this at first floor level, this is showing how we took the existing idea of this little building at the west end of the nave and extended it into the east end and put another staircase in that would then take you into the garden, in order that we could create this urban market square in the middle of our building. So this is then a huge 1:20 model that we made of the building, which then started looking more closely at the form and began to look at the ideas of material for it, that began to investigate how we could use the cloister to reveal these different spatial layers from the street here all the way back into the depth of the site. So this was an early sketch that we did that looked at how that might be achieved. And then this is what the project looks like, with these extraordinary listed tombs, and then our very lightweight diaphanous building that's sitting between the city and then this landscape space beyond. This is a view of a sketch for the education room, which shows how we drop light down the listed wall of Lambeth Palace, and then we make a space that sits between this listed fabric here and this extraordinary garden that we made in the cloister with Dan Pearson. And what we were trying to achieve with this building was this very deeply layered experience, and one whereby there would be an ambiguity between what was inside and out, and how you can see the light here at the very back of the building running down the wall of the education room, but how the building itself is both a window that's framing the tombs, and it's also sitting as a backdrop to nature, and sits as this foil, if you like, to the landscape. The idea for the cladding was twofold. Firstly, because of the archaeology of the site, the building had to be extremely light. So the whole building is made out of timber, mostly CLT, very highly insulated. And so we wanted the building to be clad in an extremely thin and lightweight material. So these are bronze tiles that we've used. The idea for the bronze tiles came from the plane trees that surround the site. So as you all know, plane trees have a very peculiar bark that flakes off in these big scales. And when it does so, it reveals all of these different colours underneath. So what we were interested in is how we could make our tiles respond to the qualities of those plane trees. So this was a drawing that looked at the different types of tiles. So the standard tile is this, and then these were the special tiles that we needed in order to make up all of the gaps and have full tiles that run around corners. So where you see the bronze inside the building, even today, 5 years later, it's shiny and reflective, but then externally, as you get closer to the road where there's a lot of pollution, the tiles at the street have gone quite dark in places. So you get this extraordinary mottled effect as you cross the site, which is talking about the effects of both time and situation on the material. This then is inside at nave level, showing how our building then begins to wrap around the existing fabric and makes this little urban space which is used for talks and events and lectures, and bands play in here and they have wedding parties, whatever. But what we were interested in is how the nave within the church, reimagined as this public urban space, would have the quality or the qualities reflected in, this is a photograph by the Italian photographer Olivio Barbieri, and this is of the Palio in Siena. And what's interesting about this is it's talking about the different horizons of time that operate within the city, and that how when the Palio takes place, this is a space for ritual, it's a festive space. But after the Palio's gone, then it's just yet another market square and you can go and buy vegetables there. And so it's this capacity for the urban landscape to operate on these different levels, at these different levels of intensity, that was interesting us. Okay, the last bit I want to talk about is an idea of working with history. A lot of the projects that we've done have had to deal with quite complex listed buildings or complex and sensitive sites. And so what I thought I would do is just talk quickly about two buildings that are addressing, if you like, different ends of history. This is a project that we made at Tanner's Hill in Deptford, where this was an old bicycle shop, and we've reworked it as an art gallery and a house for an art collector. This is Deptford High Street, and this is the main road from central London out to Dover. And the site is located here. What's interesting about the site is it's very narrow and it's very, very long. And when our client bought the site, this was just after the bicycle shop had been cleared out, you get some idea of the depth of the site. There's a person lurking in the darkness here and they're only halfway to the back of the site. And then the other key thing that you notice here is that the staircase has been taken out and it's been replaced by this ladder. So as part of this project, we began by doing some historical research into that type of 17th century townhouse in Deptford. Deptford is a very historic and ancient part of London, and in the 1980s, Historic England did a study of the houses of Deptford. And so this here is the suggested original plan of the building that we were working with. Where we started with this project was with this painting, and what we were interested in was how this painting is talking about a very long, narrow space that's got different sorts of light being dropped into different parts of the pictorial space. And so we were wondering how we could begin to use the light within this painting as a way of organising the plan of the building. So this is an axonometric that we drew, which looked at how the building would move from the street through to the back of the house, back of the site, and how we could then place new architectural elements within this composition in order to make sense of the site. So at the front, we've made this new Iroko timber screen. This is the existing fireplace that we uncovered. We would rebuild the historic stair where it would have been before it was ripped out. And then at the heart of the building, we would make an outdoor courtyard that would then drop light into the middle of the building. But also this would act as a threshold between the public gallery side of the programme and the private domestic side of the programme. And then at the very, very back of the site, we would refurbish the old Victorian stable by putting a roof light in it and dropping light down into the back of the site. So you would have the gallery at the front with the big old fireplace and the rebuilt stair. You would have the courtyard in the middle, and then at the back, you would have the residential accommodation. And this is the Victorian stable. This is the 17th century timber frame house. And this is the bit that we added in. And then here you can see it in section, how we've connected the Victorian to the 17th century via this light well. So this is a photograph from the front of the house. And as you can begin to see this idea of the light at the very heart of the project in the way that it sits in the middle of the Peter de Hoek painting. When we started work on the project, we took down the existing wall of the bike shop. Underneath it, we found this extraordinary original 17th century painted wall, which was a delight to find. So we stabilized it. We took out the small pieces of rotten oak and replaced them. And then we sealed the whole of this wall in order that it would then become this key element within the project. And then this is the view through towards the back of the house. The material idea for this project was to take a polished concrete floor that would flood from the front of the house all the way through to the back of the house. And the shiny concrete effectively is the one element that connects the 17th century through the contemporary to the Victorian element at the back. So this is at the centre of the house where the gallery runs past the courtyard, and then you can see the roof light at the back, then dropping light down into the old remnants of the Victorian stable, and then looking back the other way, back towards the street. And you can see how this shiny concrete floor is this one very subtle element that runs all the way through the project and ties everything together. And then finally, this is the reworked staircase that we discovered in that historic research document. So the last project I want to talk about very briefly is at the very, very far end of Cornwall, and is a project that we finished last year and is in the middle, it's in Newlyn Harbour. And the building that we designed sits just behind this house. But what I want to talk about is how this is a project from more recent history, but that the techniques and the ideas that one develops thinking about historic buildings from the 17th century or the 18th century or whenever can equally be adapted and modified and applied to contemporary buildings and to a contemporary historic situation. So this is a 3-story house and it's incredibly ugly. And what we did to this house was to reimagine it and to remodel it as a more contemporary building, but a building that had a far more considered connection between its position within the village and its connection to its views. So this was an early sketch for how we could go about doing that. So rather than every room have 2 windows and be a sort of ribbon of opening that ran all the way around the building, we would block up a lot of those windows, and some of the existing windows we would make a lot bigger in order that we could make an elevation or a facade for the building that was a lot more graphic, but in order that key rooms would then have a more concrete relationship to the view of the harbour that you get from this upper floor. So we effectively invented a series of rules, and the rules were no windows could get any wider than they already were, in order that we wouldn't have to undertake expensive structural work to make larger openings. So windows couldn't get wider, but they could get deeper or they could get narrower. So red means knock down and green means fill in. So this slot window becomes a huge door, as does this one, whereas this window just becomes completely filled in, and so on. So those were the rules. And then this was the construction drawing that begins to explain that and begins to explain what the key setting out points are and what the key geometrical relationships between the parts to the whole would be. So this is what it looks like now. Very much more graphic, with these huge window openings that open and then give amazing views out to the sea. There are only 3 sizes of window. There's a big square, there's a little square, or there's a door. And that very graphic language was a way of connecting this modern building, let's say, to perhaps an even more modern or contemporary tradition for how one thinks about architecture. One of the main parts of this project was how we reconfigured the whole top floor of the house. The top floor has an amazing view, but the way the house was previously organised, the top floor was divided into 5 little rooms, which had very odd little windows. So our proposal was to strip out all of the walls and to hold the roof up with these 2 great big steel T's. And then the whole of this top floor would then become one great big open space that would have views back to nature, but also being a freestanding building and a little tower, it would then map the path of the sun as the sun revolves around the house during the day. So this is the top floor. These are those 2 I-beam structures that hold up the roof. This is the existing stair. In this corner is the study. In this corner is the living space. This corner is the dining room, and this corner is the kitchen. So this is the view as you come up the stairs of one of these big structural elements. Those are the 2 of them sitting in the middle of the space holding up the roof. this corner now, where previously this was a slotty window, you now get the whole of the harbour and the whole of the view to St Michael's Mount. Oops. My PowerPoint has crashed again. Sorry. And I've only got 2 more slides to show. Typical. Okay. Nope. Can you see that? Okay, so yes, the corner with the view, and then the view out to sea, and the way that these new big windows then themselves then frame the view back of the town. So that's it. But basically, I mean, I like showing this picture at the end of lectures. It's the church at La Tourette by Le Corbusier, who is one of my favorite architects. But the reason why I show this is that Le Corbusier said something very interesting about architecture, and I think is kind of particularly interesting and pertinent to think about, particularly for you young architecture students, which is, he said that the purpose of architecture is to move you. And I think that's a very poetic and poignant way of thinking about what we're trying to do, and, you know, maybe what you should all be doing or want to do. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Al, for a great lecture.
Thank you. Should we ask the questions real quick?
Yeah, sure, fire away.
Okay, well, Lucas, do you want to ask your question, or should we ask it for you? Okay, basically he asked, is it a challenge to merge your artistic approach with the implementation of regulations when designing for a project?
I think no, because what you need to do is, if you like, an artistic ambition for a project, it's a high level idea, whereas the sort of regulatory stuff, if you like, that's kind of low level idea. And so what you need to do is to effectively make sure that you keep both the high level ideas in play, and you keep focused on the high level ideas, but also that when the regulatory stuff, if you like, comes up from below, that you don't lose what you're trying to achieve through those ideas. So sometimes there can be conflicts, but it's so long as you remain clear or you remain focused, you can hang on to them.
Sure. And then Pretty asked, she asked, what do you mean by humans control nature when looking at the brick fireplace? Shouldn't the notion be that nature is inspiration to us and should be the thing that guides our designs?
Yes, I don't mean control. What I mean is that the act of artifice, or the act of making stuff, is that's the key thing. That it's the presence of humankind having intervened within that bit of nature that affects how we understand it through the contrast between it not being there and it being there. So I think that's what I mean, that it's not a case of either or one or the other. It's the matter that I think that the one is effectively bringing the other into being. So yes, so that's what I mean. It's sort of, it's not one is more important than the other. It's the case that they're both equally important, but they're sort of you know, it's like when you're cooking and you know, you just put a little bit of salt in something and it just tastes so much better.
Yeah.
So it's like that, I think.
I agree.
The next
Mark?
question is from Mark. Yeah, would you like to come forward and ask it, or should we ask it for you?
I can ask it. Partway through your lecture, you talked about like one of the challenges of your site was trying to work around tree protection orders, and I was just wondering if there was anything else more that we should be looking out for when working with a site.
Well, different sites have different constraints, and I think, and so to come back to the art and regulatory question, I think a number of those constraints will be regulatory, and they will be imposed on you by people like the tree officer or the archaeologist or the listed building person, or you might have a huge sewer that runs under your site, or there might be a gas main that runs under your site. So there will be things that come out of the research into the site that are things that you need to work with or work around. But then I guess there are conceptual constraints, if you like, that one, I guess, instinctively or automatically brings to bear on what you're trying to do. And I think as architects, I think, or perhaps as a creative person generally, it's always useful to try to get traction from something, and getting traction on things can come from a number of different directions.
Okay, thank you.
Adam, would you like to ask yours? If not, I can read it out. So question from Adam was, how do you build around listed walls or buildings? Are there regulations for connections new walls to listed ones?
It depends. And it will depend. It depends on a number of things, but typically, there is a presumption that you won't interfere with or connect to or let's say disrupt listed fabric. But if you can make a credible, coherent, intellectual justification for why you should do it, then you can do it. So, for example, at the Garden Museum, when we are freestanding, our structure that sits within the church doesn't touch the listed fabric anywhere other than the floor. So we were very clear about the fact that our building would negotiate, if you like, the landscape of the existing church without touching it. But we also made a huge hole underneath one of the windows in order that we could connect from the nave of the church into the garden. So, and in order to do that, there was a window in the east end of the church, and we effectively took the sill of the window down to the floor level in order to make a door. So, so you could say, you know, you could argue that that's perhaps a contradictory approach, that we've gone to great lengths not to interfere with the listed building as an ethical position, whilst at the same time we've made a great big hole in it. So, but obviously the justification for making the hole enabled us to connect from the nave of the church into the garden, and therefore made sense of the project. So, so it's all about how you develop your arguments and how you respond to the specific setting.
Pretty, do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah. Thank you for the lecture, by the way. It was lovely. So for the church, it's such an important area for people as they are spiritually connected to the space. And so when you were in the design process, did you consider the opinions of the people that visited day to day? Or if not, would you consider it? Or how do you think it would have progressed or changed your proposal?
Do you mean the church in Paddington where we made the building on the end? Okay. Well, with all of our public projects, we engage in a lot of stakeholder engagement. And so at the very beginning of a project like that, we would identify who the key stakeholders are and who the relevant people to begin a dialogue are. So in the case of that project, of course, a vitally important part of that were the priest and the existing congregation, plus all the very many other partners. So there were community partners, there were business partners, there were a whole array of stakeholders that we engaged with. And so throughout the whole life of that project, we had a very extensive program of connections and communications with them. And so we, the way that was manifest was through a number of events. So at the very beginning of the project, when we first came forward with the design, or the very initial design, there were a number of open days and a number of events, and they had a whole array of community-based activities at the building as a way for us to meet the community, for the various different elements of the community to come forward and say, what about this, what about that, we like this, blah, blah, blah. And so, and what was really interesting and powerful about that whole process was that our client, who was the church, but our client, there were two parts to the client. One was the church and one was an organisation called the Paddington Development Trust. And they work with the local community and provide support to the local community. So they both had brief, and they both had input into the process. But when we then undertook the stakeholder engagement, we then got a far wider view, a far wider range of opinions came forward. So yes, that's how that happens. And on large-scale public projects like that, that level of engagement is a key part of the project.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Lucas, do you want to ask your question? I think this was. Or should we ask for you? Okay. Lucas basically asked, when retrofitting a pre-existing structure, do you risk destroying the original essence of the space, or if you do, is it intentional?
Well, it's always intentional, and whether or not we're destroying it will be dependent on what the wider requirements of the project are. So a number of projects we've done have demanded a very light touch, and but a number of projects that we've been involved with have needed a far more expansive or extensive attitude towards the existing fabric. So it's always driven by the purpose of the project and then interpreted by us and by our approach to it.
Meg, do you want to ask your question, or should we ask for you?
Hi, I can ask my thank you. Thank you, Alan, for the lovely lecture. It's quite obvious that you've talked about your artistic approach to the project. You draw inspirations and gain hints from paintings and artist works. And I was wondering if at what point in your career or in your architecture development that you started doing that, or sort of, yeah.
Well, we've always been interested in art on many levels, and spend a lot of time at the weekends hanging around art galleries and going to exhibitions, and so that's always been part of our DNA. But I think the a sort of a key formative part of this for me was before I set up Dow Jones Architects with Bieber, I used to work for Caruso St. John, and I was the project architect for the Walsall Art Gallery. And Adam and Peter, they were very interested in working with and collaborating with artists, and so it was just part of what we did then. It's part of what we do now, and I think that it makes projects more interesting. It brings another angle to a project. It makes it opens out a conversation, and I think it definitely embeds a project deeper into culture than if it's just about architecture itself.
Very much.
Okay, so I think that's all the questions. I wanted to actually ask you something about using CLT. Yeah. Was that your first project when you used CLT?
Yeah.
How was the experience using it?
It was really good, and it was it was really interesting. And the main reason why we got into CLT at that stage was we met, there's a guy called Liam Dewar, who he runs a company called Urban, and they were one of the very early adopters of CLT, and he was kind of pioneering bringing CLT into the UK. He'd worked in Switzerland, where, as you probably know, they've been using CLT for years and years and years. And Liam had worked there on a number of projects. He's an engineer by training, and he came back to the UK and set up Urban, and I met him through a friend who's an architect, and it just so happened that we met and we had a conversation just as we were put on the shortlist for the Garden Museum, and we thought, wow, hang on, we could use CLT. It would be perfect because it's very light, it's super strong, it's prefabricated, it can be built very quickly. and it would just be amazing, you know, because trying to do what we did at the first Garden Museum, in order to achieve that structure, we would probably have needed to use either steel or concrete. And obviously, we couldn't have put steel or concrete inside the church on that floor because it wouldn't have held the load. And so when we looked at CLT, it just answered all of the questions. And so so that's one of the reasons why we used it. Another reason why we used it is most of our buildings, we like to use materials that are things in themselves. So we don't like using stuff that you then cover up. You know, if it's wood, it's wood and we'll see it as wood. Or if it's brick, it's brick. Or do you know? And so we have a very elemental attitude towards the materials we use, because as I was saying, we're very interested in how a material itself can speak of a place and speak of an idea and speak of a wider or deeper cultural understanding of what architecture is. So, so when we came across CLT and it was like jumbo plywood, it's like solid and it's this thick and it answered all of our questions, it just seemed like a brilliant thing to use. So yeah, it's yeah, very fond of using CLT.
And then Pretty has one last question. Pretty, do you want to ask?
Hi. So have you considered collaborating with musicians or writers, or have you done so in the past? How would it differ from collaborating with artists?
That's a really good question. I have a very good friend who's a musician, and I've been trying to find a way to make a project work with him. And I was going to try and run a student project with him that could perhaps be a bit more experimental. But yes, I mean, you know, there are some examples of, I don't know if you're familiar, but Le Corbusier collaborated with a Greek musician on the fenestration of La Tourette. And so they used musical interval as a way of making the facade fenestration. So, but there aren't many examples of musicians and architects collaborating, but it would be really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's one more last question to the left-hand part.
Yeah, that's can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is I've got a few more. I've got like 3 questions I'd like to ask you, just quick ones. I know you've been here for a while. So actually we did one of my colleagues, we did some piece, a report on one of your works on the Cardiff Maggie Centre in Cardiff. Really brilliant. One thing I want to ask you was when it comes to sustainability, I know it kind of brings out certain constraints, and I wanted to pick up your opinion on constraints. Do you think when you have constraints or restrictions through a design process, does that bring out innovative ideas? What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's out of those constraints that you need to be almost more creative. And so, yeah, no, yes, I totally agree with that. And I think that one of the constraints that we're now interested in is we now are trying not to use concrete. Having shown you a concrete building earlier, I don't think we'll ever do that again. because, you know, as I'm sure you all know, concrete is an absolute disaster for the environment. You know, is it 8 or 12% of global CO2 comes from the cement industry? I mean, it's some, you know, look it up. I used to know the figure, but it's an environmental calamity. So we're now thinking, okay, how can we not use concrete again?
All right. Another question is, how do you approach your clients? Is there a generic way of you approaching your clients, or does that depend on the brief?
It depends on the brief and it depends on the client, and it's all very much, it's a very fluid relationship, and all clients are different, and all projects are different. Even if two projects look like they're going to be the same, they're always different. And that's very much to do with the dynamic and the ambition of the client. I mean, you know, you get, from good clients, you get good projects.
Okay, never thought of it that way. I've got another question, just two more, just bear with me.
Three.
Yeah. So the other one is what, because I know in being an architect, you work with a huge team through the design process. What advice would you give when you're working with other people working in different sectors, like the engineers and the contractors? Is there any advice you would give on how you go along working with them?
Yeah, empathy. Yeah. I think what I always try to do is try to put myself in their shoes and think, okay, how are they seeing this? And so, for example, you know, when the structural engineer sends through their initial design and they've got columns in places where you don't want columns, and you think, okay, well, obviously we don't want columns there, but they've put them there for a reason. So how can I help them think their way out of this problem? And what can I, you know, what's within, what do I need to adapt or change or give up in order to achieve, let's say, no columns? So what I would say is there's no point screaming and shouting.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, let's go. One last question.
Okay.
What's your favorite part through the design process and why?
I think it's that split-second moment when you see what the project's going to be like. You know, it's kind of somewhere deep inside you, you get that image, you get that vision, you get that sort of that thing that kind of, you know, it gets you. Is it either there or is it here? I'm not quite sure, but that's when you know your project's right. And it's when that happens, that's the most exciting bit. Then the most enjoyable bit is looking for that.
Right. Thank you very much. Because we had I think first year I did a project where I was looking into cotton steel, which is what you use for the Maggie Center, and the project was completed in 2020, like last year, and it was really interesting working on that project with my team, because as you said, you like to show the actual element of the material, and I think that was really it's really inspirational.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thank you too.
A pleasure.
Okay, are there any other questions? Are there any other questions from anybody else? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Alan, for the interesting lecture. I'm pretty sure everybody had a really good time and we had a pretty good turnout. To everybody that's still here, we will be posting the lecture up so you can go refer to everything that Alan was talking about after this session, obviously. And
Yeah.
And thank you everyone for a nice discussion at the end and all the questions. It was really great to hear and see everyone actually as well.
And thank you so much, Alan, for coming
Pleasure.
here and doing
Yeah,
this.
pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
There's
Great
also
one.
coming in for the chat.
Bye, guys. Have a good Christmas.